A fearless black attorney steps into the courtroom, determined to defend an innocent man. But when crucial evidence mysteriously disappears and a corrupt officer lurks behind her with a chilling threat, Olivia Carter realizes this isn't just a case. It's a battle against a system designed to silence her. Can she turn the tables before she becomes the next target? Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against injustice, even when the odds were stacked against them? What would you do in Olivia's shoes? Share your thoughts below, because justice isn't just fought in the courtroom, it's defended by all of us. This is the story of Olivia Carter, a woman who refuses to back down, a lawyer willing to risk everything to expose the truth. But when the fight for justice turns into a fight for survival, will she make it out unscathed? The morning air inside the Durham County Courthouse was thick, heavy with the scent of stale coffee, polished oak, and the quiet tension that always preceded a high-stakes trial. Olivia Carter had been in courtrooms like this countless times before, but today felt different. Dressed in a navy blue suit that projected confidence, she moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floors. Every step measured, every breath controlled. She wasn't just here to defend Jamal Rivers. She was here to expose a lie, to dismantle a case built on corruption. She had seen too many cases like his before. A young black man, a vague charge, a system that refused to listen. But Olivia wasn't the kind of attorney who backed down. Not now. Not ever. As she approached the defense table, a nagging sensation settled in her gut. Something felt off. A whisper of unease brushed against the back of her mind, subtle but insistent. Then she saw it, a single folded note, neatly placed on top of her case files. The courtroom around her faded into silence. The soft murmur of clerks and attorneys moving about became distant, muffled. Olivia reached for the note, unfolding it with steady fingers, slow, deliberate, as if she already knew it wouldn't be good. 7 words, sharp, cold, unmistakable. Walk away while you still can. This is not a fight you can win. A chill wrapped around her spine, but only for a moment. Fear had no place here. She had been threatened before. She knew intimidation when she saw it. She knew what it looked like, what it smelled like. But this felt different. This wasn't just a warning. It was a dare. Her grip tightened around the note. Her jaw clenched just slightly before she let out a slow, measured exhale. They wanted her to step back, to doubt herself, to leave. Instead, she folded the note carefully, tucked it into her briefcase, and adjusted her blazer. Her father once told her, when power tries to silence you, that means you're standing in the right place. She lifted her chin, squared her shoulders. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, the polished wood gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Beyond them, Jamal Rivers was waiting. For justice, for someone to believe in him. And Olivia Carter had never been one to walk away. With steady hands and fire in her chest, she pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The fight for justice had begun. The courtroom wasn't just a place where justice was served, it was a battleground. And Sergeant Michael Grayson? He was a man who always walked away unscathed. He didn't just wear the badge, he wielded it. For nearly 2 decades, Grayson had operated in Durham like a law unto himself. He wasn't the kind of cop who got his hands dirty, at least, not in a way anyone could prove. Complaints were filed, but they never went anywhere. Evidence against him had a way of disappearing. Officers who spoke out didn't stay in their positions for long. And the people he arrested? They either learned to keep quiet, or they didn't make it far enough to be heard. He had built himself into an untouchable force, not because he followed the law, but because he knew how to bend it until it broke in his favor. He understood how the system worked. He knew who to intimidate, who to bribe, who to let slide. He didn't just play the game, he wrote the rules. And today, he was walking into that courtroom as if he already knew the outcome. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and Grayson stepped inside, his presence shifting the energy of the room. He wasn't just another officer testifying. He was a man who carried himself like the law itself. His uniform was crisp, his posture exuding quiet authority. But it was his eyes, cold, assessing, watchful, that told the real story. He scanned the room, his gaze sweeping over the attorneys, the judge, the jury. Some of them nodded in subtle acknowledgement, others lowered their eyes, avoiding his stare. A silent confirmation of the fear and power he commanded. Then, he saw her. Olivia Carter. And for the first time, a flicker of something different crossed his face. Curiosity, maybe even amusement. She wasn't like the others. Most attorneys, especially public defenders, knew their place. They fought their battles within the lines he allowed. They didn't push too hard, didn't ask the wrong questions, didn't challenge the kind of power men like him wielded. But Olivia? She didn't look away. Their eyes locked, and for a brief second, it was as if the entire courtroom faded into the background. Then he smirked. It wasn't just confidence, it was a warning. As if to say, you don't belong here. You don't win here. Walk away while you still can. But Olivia Carter didn't walk away. She lifted her chin slightly, holding his gaze. No hesitation, no fear. And that's when Grayson realized something he hadn't expected. This one wasn't going to back down. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with the usual pre-trial energy, attorneys murmuring last-minute arguments, clerks darting between offices, the rhythmic shuffle of polished shoes on marble floors. Olivia Carter walked with purpose, her grip firm on her briefcase, her thoughts sharpened like a blade. She had a job to do. Then he stepped into her path. Michael Grayson. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't coincidence. It was intentional. He stood just close enough to force her to stop, his presence swallowing the space between them. Deliberate. Calculated. A man too comfortable in his power. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the hallway faded. The distant hum of legal chatter dissolved into the background. All that remained was the slow, suffocating weight of silence stretching between them. A game of patience, of control. Then he smirked. You shouldn't waste your time on that criminal. His voice was calm, casual, the kind of confidence that came from knowing no one would dare challenge him. Olivia studied him, not just his words, but the way he said them. Like a fact, not an opinion. Like the verdict had already been decided. Like he had already won. Her fingers flexed against the leather handle of her briefcase. The old Olivia, the one fresh out of law school, still clinging to the idea that justice was a straight road, might have hesitated. Might have chosen her words carefully, afraid to make the wrong enemy. But not anymore. She let the silence linger, just long enough to make it clear. She wasn't intimidated. Then she spoke. You don't decide who's guilty and who isn't. No hesitation. No anger. Just truth. A flicker. Barely there, but Olivia caught it. The way his jaw tensed, the way something dark flashed behind his eyes before he buried it beneath another smirk. And then he leaned in. You'll learn soon enough, Carter. The way he said her name, slow, deliberate, like a promise. Then, just as easily as he had stepped into her path, he straightened, adjusted the cuffs of his uniform, and walked away. Olivia didn't move. She let the chill of his words settle around her, let the moment carve itself into her mind. That wasn't a conversation. That was a warning. But as she took a slow breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward, one thought ran through her mind. He thought he had already won. That was his first mistake. The courtroom was a machine, gears of the justice system grinding forward, steady and unchanging. Lawyers whispered at their tables, the judge flipped through case files, the clerk sorted paperwork with routine precision. Everything moved as it should. Until Michael Grayson decided otherwise. He strolled in, not walked, not hurried, but with the kind of deliberate ease that sent a clear message. He wasn't here to answer to anyone. His uniform was immaculate, his posture unshaken. But it wasn't just the badge, the polished shoes, or the crisp creases in his sleeves that commanded attention. It was the way people reacted to him. The way a juror shifted uncomfortably as Grayson passed. The way the prosecution barely glanced up as if his presence was expected, routine. The way Judge Owens, known for his rigid authority, didn't even acknowledge him. This wasn't just confidence. This was control. And then he made his move. As Olivia stood to address the court, Grayson shifted. It was subtle. A slow shake of his head, the ghost of a smirk. A quiet chuckle, just loud enough to be heard, just soft enough to be dismissed as nothing. It was a warning, disguised as amusement. Judge Owens flicked his eyes upward briefly, then back to his papers. No reprimand, no reaction at all. And that was the problem. Because men like Grayson didn't need to disrupt the system to control it. They were the system. Olivia felt the heat of a dozen unspoken rules pressing against her. Rules that said the police always win. The defense never does. Not today. She didn't tighten her grip on the defense table, didn't let her shoulders tense. She simply adjusted her blazer, ran a slow hand over her sleeve, and turned toward him. "Something funny, Sergeant?" A pause, a long one. For a moment, the courtroom belonged to her. Grayson's smirk didn't waver, but something in his posture shifted, a flicker of irritation, quickly buried beneath practiced amusement. "Nothing at all, counselor." He let the last word stretch, slow and condescending. Then, with a slight tilt of his chin, he added, "Please, go on." It was a performance, a carefully measured display of authority. A silent reminder to the room. I don't need to say a word to remind you who runs this place. But Olivia Carter wasn't here to play by his rules. She squared her shoulders, turned back to the judge, and spoke with the kind of deliberate clarity that refused to be overshadowed. "Let's proceed." She felt his gaze still on her, felt the weight of the silent battle waged beneath the surface. But Grayson had underestimated one thing. He wasn't the only one who knew how to play the long game. The weight of the moment pressed against Olivia's chest, not crushing, not suffocating, but there, present, unshakable. She had been in courtrooms like this before. She had felt pressure, faced impossible odds. But this was different. This wasn't just about arguing a case. This was about challenging something bigger, something built to silence people like her. She knew how power worked in rooms like this. She could see it now, wrapped around Michael Grayson like armor, woven into the very walls of the courthouse. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to object. He just had to exist, loudly enough. And that was the real danger. Not the kind that came with threats in the dark or fists raised in anger. The kind that had settled deep into the bones of the system, hiding in plain sight, protected by its own silence. Olivia exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She could feel him watching her. Not just him. The jury, the prosecution, the quiet expectation that she would fold beneath the weight of what this moment represented. But she didn't, because fear wasn't the enemy, it was the fire. It sharpened her focus, tightened her resolve, reminded her exactly why she was here. Grayson wanted her to hesitate, wanted her to doubt herself, wanted her to understand this wasn't a fight she could win. But Olivia Carter wasn't here to win. She was here to expose, to challenge, to make sure, for the first time in his career, Michael Grayson wasn't the only force in the room. She thought of Jamal Rivers, sitting behind her, waiting for someone to believe in him. Thought of every case before this, every time power tried to silence the truth. Not today. She adjusted her blazer, ran a slow hand over her sleeve, and lifted her head. Then she spoke. "Your Honor, the defense is ready to proceed." A pause. The moment hung in the air, thick and weighted. Then the judge nodded, and just like that, the trial began. The air in the courtroom felt different now. Tense, weighted, as if everyone inside had, in some unspoken way, come to the same realization. This wasn't just about Jamal Rivers. This wasn't just about whether one man had resisted arrest or whether the officer's account could be trusted. This was about something much larger. And the people in the gallery could feel it. They had come expecting a trial. What they were witnessing was a battle. A battle not just between a defense attorney and a decorated officer, but between truth and the weight of a system that had always leaned in one direction. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others sat perfectly still, their attention locked on Olivia Carter, watching her defy a force they had been taught was untouchable. Because here was the truth. This courtroom didn't belong to her. It belonged to men like Michael Grayson. Men who didn't need to demand power because they already had it, built into the walls, into the silence, into the unspoken rules that had allowed them to stand untouched for years. And yet, Olivia Carter wasn't moving like someone who knew the game was rigged. She stood tall, steady, unfazed, her voice cutting through the air with the kind of certainty that made people sit up a little straighter. She wasn't just defending a client. She was challenging the very foundation of the room she was standing in. Some in the audience felt a flicker of hope. Others felt fear. Because when the system was questioned, anything could happen. And that was what made this moment so dangerous. The air inside the courtroom had shifted. A slow, suffocating tension pressed down on everyone. Thick, heavy, inescapable. For the first time, it felt like the system itself was fighting back. Olivia Carter stood at the center of it, her every move deliberate, her voice steady as she presented the evidence. A surveillance video, the key to her defense, the proof that Jamal Rivers had not resisted arrest. "This video," she said, holding the courtroom in her grip, "clearly shows the events as they actually happened. No aggression, no resistance, just a man being pulled to the ground before he even had a chance to speak." She pressed play. A fraction of a second passed, too long, too quiet. The screen flickered to black before the footage came to life. A moment of silence. Then the narrative shifted. Jamal wasn't standing still like she had seen before. In this version of the footage, he was moving. He was resisting. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A murmur of unease spread through the jury box. Olivia's eyes darted toward them. Some leaned forward, brows furrowed, doubt creeping in. Others stiffened, their confidence in her defense slipping away like sand through fingers. This wasn't the video she had reviewed. Someone had tampered with the evidence. She forced herself to keep her breathing even, but her fingers curled around the edge of the defense table. A cold weight settled in her stomach. Had she misremembered? Had she overlooked something? No. The angles, the movement. This was not the footage she had seen. Across the room, Michael Grayson leaned back in his chair, arms resting lazily at his sides as if the outcome had already been decided. The prosecutor, who had barely glanced at Olivia before, now leaned in, attentive, almost amused. "Well, counselor," he said smoothly, "it seems your key evidence just made our case." A calculated smirk, a glance toward the jury, a moment Olivia had seen play out too many times before. Her mind raced. This was the turning point. Either she found a way to dismantle this, or Jamal Rivers was going to prison. She straightened her posture, let the tension settle one last time. Then, with quiet finality, she lifted her chin. For the first time in the trial, Olivia Carter felt something unfamiliar, a sliver of doubt. The evidence she had built her case around, the undeniable truth she had held like a shield, had just been twisted into a weapon against her. A setup, a deliberate, calculated deception. She had seen corruption before, had fought against it, had expected it, but not like this, not this bold, not this blatant. Her pulse hammered against her ribs, but her face remained composed. She couldn't let them see her falter. She glanced at the jury. The uncertainty was setting in. She had minutes, maybe seconds, before this case slipped beyond her reach. Olivia had always known that power in a courtroom wasn't just about facts. It was about perception. And right now, perception was turning against her. She needed another way. Keeping her movements controlled, Olivia slid her phone from her pocket beneath the defense table, her fingers moving fast. She typed out a single message. "Urgent. Need the original video. Now." Then she hit send. Across the room, a man in the gallery glanced down at his phone. A brief flicker of recognition in his eyes before he slipped the device back into his coat. Detective Marcus Reed, a man who, under different circumstances, might have been sitting at the prosecution's table. A cop with years on the force, one of the few who still believed in the job, in justice, in the idea that the badge meant something more than unchecked authority. He didn't look at her, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the message at all. But Olivia knew. If there was a way to get the original footage, he would find it. She straightened her back, exhaled slowly, and looked back toward the judge. The prosecution thought they had backed her into a corner. What they didn't realize was that Olivia Carter had just made her next move. The courthouse hallways had emptied, leaving behind only the distant hum of overhead lights and the rhythmic echo of Olivia's footsteps. The trial had ended for the day, but the weight of it still pressed against her. She wasn't alone. She felt it before she saw him, a presence, deliberate, intentional, calculated. She didn't stop walking, didn't give him the satisfaction of hesitation. But as she turned the corner, Michael Grayson stepped forward, blocking her path. He didn't speak right away, didn't have to. The silence stretched, heavy, loaded, dangerous. Then, the smirk, the same one he had worn in the courtroom, the one that said he knew exactly how this would end. "You think the FBI can protect you forever?" His voice was steady, too calm. He took a step closer, not enough to touch, but enough to be felt. "You're fighting a battle you can't win, counselor. Walk away while you still can." The words weren't just a warning. They were a promise. A reminder that men like him didn't just operate inside the courtroom. They existed in the shadows, in the spaces between laws, in the silence of those who knew better than to challenge them. This wasn't just intimidation. This was power. And yet, Olivia didn't flinch. She held his gaze, steady and unshaken, studying him the way she would a witness on the stand. He was testing her, watching, waiting to see if she would break. Her breath was even, but she could feel her pulse hammering beneath her skin. For the first time she understood, this wasn't about Jamal Rivers anymore. It never was. She exhaled slowly, controlled. "Are we done here, Sergeant?" A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, maybe even amusement. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "For now." Then he stepped back, watched her for just a second too long, and walked away. The hallway stretched empty once more, but Olivia remained still, listening to his footsteps fade. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath. She exhaled, slow and steady, letting the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders. This wasn't just a case, it was war. And she was far from finished. The courthouse hallways had emptied, leaving behind only the distant hum of overhead lights and the rhythmic echo of Olivia's footsteps. The trial had ended for the day, but the weight of it still pressed against her. She wasn't alone. She felt it before she saw him. A presence, deliberate, intentional, calculated. She didn't stop walking, didn't give him the satisfaction of hesitation. But as she turned the corner, Michael Grayson stepped forward, blocking her path. He didn't speak right away, didn't have to. The silence stretched, heavy, loaded, dangerous. Then, the smirk. The same one he had worn in the courtroom, the one that said he knew exactly how this would end. "You think the FBI can protect you forever?" His voice was steady, too calm. He took a step closer. "Not enough to touch, but enough to be felt. You're fighting a battle you can't win, counselor. Walk away while you still can." The words weren't just a warning. They were a promise. A reminder that men like him didn't just operate inside the courtroom. They existed in the shadows, in the spaces between laws, in the silence of those who knew better than to challenge them. This wasn't just intimidation. This was power. And yet, Olivia didn't flinch. She held his gaze, steady and unshaken, studying him the way she would a witness on the stand. He was testing her, watching, waiting to see if she would break. Her breath was even, but she could feel her pulse hammering beneath her skin. For the first time, she understood. This wasn't about Jamal Rivers anymore. It never was. She exhaled slowly, controlled. "Are we done here, Sergeant?" A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, maybe even amusement. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "For now." Then he stepped back, watched her for just a second too long, and walked away. The hallway stretched empty once more, but Olivia remained still, listening to his footsteps fade. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath. She exhaled, slow and steady, letting the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders. This wasn't just a case. It was war. And she was far from finished. The next morning, Olivia Carter walked into the courtroom calm, composed, and quiet. Too quiet. She took her seat at the defense table without a word, barely sparing a glance at the prosecution. She didn't straighten her blazer like she usually did. She didn't look toward the jury. She barely even looked at Michael Grayson. But he looked at her. And what he saw made him smirk. Defeat. It was all there. The slight slump of her shoulders. The way she kept her eyes down. Like she had finally realized she was outmatched. Grayson leaned back in his chair, stretching out like a man who had already won. Olivia had seen this before. Men like him, so sure of their own invincibility, so comfortable in the belief that no one could touch them. And that was exactly why she had let him believe it. Because sometimes the best move isn't to fight back right away. It's to let them think they've won. The prosecution wasted no time pressing their advantage. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, his voice confident, measured, dripping with self-assurance. "The defense has failed to produce any evidence that contradicts the prosecution's case." A pause. Then, for the first time since entering the courtroom, Olivia moved. She placed her hands on the defense table, exhaled slowly, then stood. She didn't look at the judge, didn't look at the jury. She turned ever so slightly toward Grayson, and then in a voice that was steady, deliberate, and just loud enough, she said, "Actually, I do have something to present." A ripple of confusion spread through the courtroom. The judge's brow lifted. The prosecutor stiffened. Grayson's smirk faltered, just slightly. Olivia reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen. A soft click. And then, you think the FBI can protect you forever? Grayson's voice filled the courtroom. You're fighting a battle you can't win, counselor. Walk away while you still can. The words hung in the air, twisting in the silence like a noose. For the first time, Grayson wasn't the one in control. His smirk was gone. His fingers curled against the edge of the prosecution's table, his jaw tightening just slightly. The entire courtroom had frozen. The jury sat motionless, their eyes locked on the man who had just incriminated himself in front of everyone. The judge exhaled sharply, his expression unreadable as he leaned forward. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "are you telling this court that the lead officer in this case threatened you outside of these proceedings?" Olivia let the silence stretch, long enough to let the weight of it settle over the room. Then, without breaking eye contact with Grayson, she tapped the screen again. Click. "I don't have to tell you, Your Honor." He already did. The silence in the courtroom didn't last long. The moment Olivia's recording finished playing, chaos erupted. The prosecution scrambled, voices overlapping in hurried whispers. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench, demanding order. The jury, stunned, unmoving, sat with expressions ranging from shock to quiet realization. But Olivia? She just watched Michael Grayson. He was still seated, but he was no longer the man who had walked into court this morning, certain of his victory. His face was tight, his jaw locked, his hands clenched so hard against the table that his knuckles turned white. This was a man who had never expected to lose, and yet he had. "Sergeant Grayson," the judge's voice rang across the courtroom, heavy with authority. "You will remain here while we determine the next steps regarding these serious allegations." The words landed like a hammer. Grayson's head snapped toward the judge, a flicker of desperation behind his eyes. "Your Honor, that is all, Sergeant." Cut off. Just like that. For the first time, Michael Grayson was no longer the one controlling the room. A pair of officers, his own colleagues, stepped forward. He didn't resist, didn't protest. But as they led him toward the exit, Olivia saw it. The last glance he threw over his shoulder, a mixture of disbelief, fury, and something else. Defeat. And then, he was gone. The weight in the room lifted. For the first time, justice had pressed back. The judge turned back to the jury. A moment passed. Then, the verdict. In the case of the state versus Jamal Rivers, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. For a fraction of a second, everything stood still. Then, the sound of relief. A sharp exhale from Jamal, a gasp from his mother in the gallery, the murmur of voices rising as the reality of the verdict settled in. Jamal turned to Olivia, his eyes wide with something between gratitude and disbelief. She nodded once. The truth had won today, and sometimes that was enough. The crisp afternoon air hit Olivia as she stepped through the towering doors of the courthouse. The weight of the trial, of everything that had happened, still clung to her. She paused at the top of the courthouse steps, taking in the scene before her. Jamal was still inside, surrounded by his family, his mother in tears, his sister clutching his hand as if she never wanted to let go. Reporters clustered near the sidewalk, waiting for a statement. The courthouse square buzzed with murmurs, whispers of what had just unfolded inside. But Olivia didn't rush toward the cameras. She just stood still, breathing it all in. Then, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She answered. Olivia Carter? A brief pause. Then, a deep, measured voice, one she immediately recognized. "You did the right thing, Carter." David Reynolds, FBI Director. "We'll handle the rest." For the first time since the trial began, Olivia let herself smile. Not because it was over, but because the fight had been worth it. She ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket. And as she walked down those courthouse steps, she knew this wasn't the last battle she'd fight. Justice wasn't a finish line. It was a war, one that had to be fought, case by case, step by step. But today she had won. She turned her gaze toward the press, toward the people watching, waiting for her to say something. And when she finally spoke, her voice was clear, unshaken. Justice isn't easy. It never has been. But if we don't fight for it, who will? The cameras flashed. The crowd leaned in, and Olivia Carter walked forward, ready for whatever came next. If this story moved you, if it made you think, then don't let it end here. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories that matter. Your support isn't just a number. It's what fuels us to keep creating meaningful content that shines a light on truth, justice, and the people who fight for it. So, what do you think? Would you have stood your ground like Olivia did? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next story.